Jake kept his eyes on the cracked road that lay ahead as he pushed through the thick bushes. His boots scraped against the trash that was all over the empty road. There were a lot of empty cans, faded wrappers, and rusty tools that people had left behind when they ran away. But he could only rely on scavenging now. And if he couldn't find useful things, it was just one more step toward the same end as those who came before him. On either side of the highway, tall trees made it look like a dark cave. Strange shadows danced around the edges of his vision. They were reminders of the hard days he had spent adjusting to his new, sad life. Jake has been walking alone since his group was attacked last winter. Most of his old friends were probably now among the lost souls who were constantly wandering around the crumbling towns and countrysides. There was a sudden electronic buzz that broke the heavy quiet. With his axe raised, Jake turned around quickly. His mind was screaming danger. He was met with nothing but static, then a familiar loud voice. The main event of the night is about to start. We have some fresh meat ready to be killed. Put your money on what will happen, and come see it. The voice kept talking broken nonsense as Jake cautiously got closer to the old radio that was lying in the bushes by the road. Brown leaves, long since dead, were all over the speakers. Even though it was distorted, the message still cut through the blackness that stretched in every direction. When he thought about fights being shown for entertainment, it made his mouth hurt. But maybe competing with other people was a better way to find meaning than desperately looking for things on your own. Jake kept going down the gully that led to the source of the broadcasts while holding his axe. Broken trees stood at odd angles, their skeleton fingers reaching for the sky. Stumped grass and trash that were left behind when society fell apart a long time ago. There was now only nothingness left. Jake slowed down as he could see buildings through the bushes. Bricks that were falling apart stuck out in all sorts of crazy directions from what used to be a huge city center. A rusty sign said that this was a government building, but any power that it once had long since been taken away. Jake stopped at the gates and looked over the mess. There was a strange calm in the area, but there was still an unspoken threat. As Jake went deeper into the empty military base, he saw flashes of movement that made him jump. He turned around with his axe raised, but all he heard was the drifting of flowers. Suddenly, a cracked laugh could be heard through the utter silence. This was followed by loud cheers and clapping that seemed to come from everywhere. As Jake crept toward the noise, a huge opening opened in front of him and led down into darkness. A blast of hot, sulfurous air came from the darkness, like the breath of a beast that lived underground. Jake slid down the rocky path while holding on tight to his weapon. His throat was scratched by fetid air that smelled like something wild and made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. At the base, a worn-out metal door blocked access to whatever sins were already there. The yells and shouts got louder, like someone who couldn't get enough of the violence. Jake took one last deep breath to calm himself down before pushing the door open and walking into madness. A huge pit gaped ahead, surrounded by old, rusty metal scaffolding that was full of people watching. The ground was covered in phlegm and other unnameable waste that had been stirred up by many feet walking on it. People with twisted faces and bright eyes looked down at the killing going on below. There in the dim light of the buzzing floods, people fought and cut each other up as red spray filled the dusk, dented air. The crowd's wild howls came over Jake in waves and blocked out any rational thought. What kind of new hell did he find himself in? At that very moment, a bigger shape slowly turned to look at Jake with eyes that didn't look like they were just hungry. Its lips pulled back in a grin as it looked at its new prey. The broken gate shook and rose with a groan, letting the changed beasts inside go after their prey. With a steady breath, Jake tightened his grip and got ready to be a part in whatever evil games were going on in this abandoned place. He had come looking for a reason to live. Now it looked like a fight would decide whether he would leave alive or broken. The bio-enhanced infected moved and coordinated in ways that were not normal. Jake jumped out of the way as claws went over the spot where he had been standing moments before. His heart hit his ribs hard. These were not mindless cannibals. Behind their eyes was predatory intelligence that had been changed by the trials going on in this pit of horrors. Jake got up and swung his axe in a wide circle, cutting off a limb that was holding on to him. As the monster screamed, blackened ichor sprayed out from its body. There was no time to think about the horrible thing because two more rushed forward as the yells from the crowd reached a crazy peak. Jake dove low, spun, and cut an attacker's fist off its arm. The animal screamed and flailed its hurt limb in anger, but it did not fall. As Jake slammed his axe into the twisted helmet, bone and brain matter were crushed into a pulpy mess. He pushed the shaking body away and turned to face the last opponent. But when he saw who it was, he stopped in shock. Dozens of people were now crowded at the entrance, eager to join the kill. He was just something that this violent crowd could use to satisfy their hunger. Jake ran away while spinning on his heel. But he couldn't get away. A steep cliff stood between him and freedom. And below, more horrible things kept going around and around. Every time there was a drop of blood, the crowd's hunger grew even stronger. Jake turned around to stand his ground and raised his axe just as the rush hit him. More death and destruction broke out as steel cut through twisted limbs. When impulses took over, he did things like duck, spin, hack, and slash like he was crazy. He didn't know how long the blur of rage went on for. All that counted was each kill bought a few more seconds of life in this terrible furnace. Little by little, the tide went out, and Jake was surrounded by a hill of squirming bodies. Even though his chest hurt and his mind was racing, he dared to think it was over. As the gates slammed shut again, cheers erupted from the hills. Jake swayed on his feet, his strength fading as the rush of adrenaline swept through him. A man in sharp clothes walked toward him across the bodies. He was surrounded by hooded guards, and his face was smooth, except for a small smile. "What a wonderful show." He said it with a flair. "You're really good at killing people. I think you should use those skills in a better way." When Jake looked at him, his smile got bigger. "Don't be afraid. If you play along, you'll benefit quite a bit. A warm meal and a good night's sleep might help you feel better. Jake's frown got even worse as he realized that such niceties came with big bills. But with the crowd yelling at him and death close behind, he had no choice but to use this hellish situation to get a short break. He locked his gaze on the figure in front of him, gave it a short nod, and then followed it up the rusty stairs, leaving the destruction behind for the unknown horrors that lay ahead. Before them, locks groaned open, letting light and noise into a winding hallway. The stinky air was mixed with the smell of roasting meat and sugary laughing, as Jake's new host talked about future shows, prizes, and glory for those who mastered the pit. Guards rushed in. No one seemed to notice or care that Jake was being led to his death. He would go along with it for now and try to get away, but this place would burn down no matter what, before he was just another piece in their evil games. Jake poked at the food in front of him, but he was too tired to eat more than a few bites. How long had he been stuck in a cycle of rage that would never end? Days, weeks, and months had no meaning for him. After he was locked up, all that was on his mind was each upcoming fight in the ring and how weak he was getting. Other contestants ate and drank at shiny tables while yelling and drinking loudly. But their laughter couldn't hide the hopelessness in their sunken eyes or the weakness in their limbs that showed they were losing strength. They knew just as well as Jake what was in store for those who stopped acting to the crowd's delight. People had seen glimpses of the infected retirees making their last rounds in closed pens where they were kept rabid and unpredictable for culling. No, the only way to be saved was to run away. But getting past the well-guarded walls seemed impossible, and giving in meant an inevitable, brutal death. As Jake looked around the property, he saw that there were well-armed guards and hardened alleys blocking all the exits. Technology also gave the leader and his researchers disturbing control over the people they were testing, as Jake found out when he tried to say no. Everyone was startled when a scream cut through the jumbled thoughts. Hidden monitors showed video of the most recent battle, which featured a fat woman flailing her shovel against changes that were too violent for this stage of the twisting tests. The top who were watching didn't do much more than feel mildly disappointed when they heard her gurgling death. Jake's stomach turned again as they looked at her flaws without caring. He heard footsteps and saw a padded hand clamp down on his tired muscles to check them out. My, you're barely fit for the kennels at this rate. Pity, you showed such promise. The boss grinned down with false warmth, but perhaps one final bout could salvage your usefulness. Win, and you live another day to entertain. Lose, and well, motivation grows scarce, wouldn't you say? It was chosen without anyone's input. Back to the depths to kill or die. Jake pushed himself to his feet and dragged himself to face another test. But would he live long enough to find a way out? Or would tonight's match be his death? Jake made up his mind that he had to go down into hell again because he had no other choice. As Jake stumbled into the arena, the crowd roared with excitement. Flaming lights burned his eyes and blocked his view of whatever horrible things were waiting for him outside the iron cages. He stumbled around mindlessly, fighting the urge to give up, to fall down, and finally end the pain. Not yet, no. Jake turned his head to try to see through the glare and figure out how many and how strong the enemies that were hiding were. The air was then filled with a harsh screech. A flood of running, leaping horrors filled the lights as silhouettes. A huge figure knocked Jake off balance and laughed loudly as it slammed his broken body into the ground. As the claws went for his throat, a primal anger rushed through him that wouldn't let him die as prey. Jake grabbed the huge wrist with a yell and yanked, twisting the joint out of its socket in a spray of dark fluid. Jake spun on top of the shaking monster to face the coming wave, feeling energized by the powerful rush of anger. In the heat of the fighting, reason left and darkness took over. He turned into the horror these twisted souls feared, cutting and ripping flesh with no thought for the next kill. Time blurred into an endless stream of killing, turning the arena red under the bloody glow of the factory lights. At last, everything was quiet except for the sound of the thick drizzle. Jake stood alone among the cut limbs and mutilated torsos, his chest heaving as the madness slowly faded. A loud cheer filled the property and shook loose dust off of high railings and scaffolding. People watching from above praised the fighter wildly as he beat wave after impossible wave. Their ally, their entertainment, and the fuel for their evil plans. Jake shifted on his feet and looked up, but he didn't want to see the base of operations that was hidden high above the fighting, behind steel and glass railings. The leader watched with a smile as sharp as a knife, judging a new form of sadism made better by the drugs that were running through Jake's veins. Whatever humanity he still had was lost the moment he tasted the alluring call of Bloodsport. Now, the madness and its siren song were the only things that could stop the painful death that was waiting for failure. As he stumbled out of the arena to cheers, Jake gave in to its embrace once more. Now it was time for Jake's last fight and bid for bloody revenge. When he walked into the stadium, there was a cacophony of screams and jeers. The crowd was yelling for bloody guts until their hysteria reached its peak. Jake slowly raised his head. He was no longer the hopeless person who walked this road for the first time. His eyes were bright with a primal rage that had been honed by trials after cruel trials. The mechanical screech broke the air and sent everyone into a coma. First, one shambler stumbled into the light, and then another. The bodies were stitched together in a disgusting attempt to look like they were alive. Their twisted smiles showed that they were always hungry, and no amount of sacrifice could satisfy that hunger. More come out, clawing at fresh meat with unnaturally coordinated arms that don't work together. Jake let out an answering growl as memories of friends being eaten came flooding back. Piece by piece, humanity was being taken away inside these walls. Now was the time to tear it all apart. With his axe so tight that his fingers hurt, Jake threw himself into the tide. With a wet crunch, his first swing caved in a skull and spurted ichor, which made everyone cheer. As he spun, he cut off a raised arm as smoothly as a well-oiled machine. He was taken over by frenzy, which buried thought under a sea of anger. His axe sang a horrible song that cut yawning, smiles off of gnashing faces. Limbs and torsos fell in a mess of broken pieces that covered the arena floor with blood. As the last body hit the ground, the crowd of people who were watching went silent. Their winner stood in a pool of blood, gasping for air as madness flashed in his eyes. From the top viewing box, slow, mocking clapping broke the silence. A single figure stood out against the angry floodlights, with only the tiniest smile on his face. Bravo! Our star has outdone himself once more. What a spectacle! It seems even the beasts tire of their games in the end. Pity it had to conclude so. Abruptly, he slowly snapped his fingers together, and with a groan, secret gates opened. Shapes shambled into the light. They were figures that couldn't be saved because they were made up of many broken souls. As they moved toward the lone fighter trapped below, the corroded flesh and nightmares took on a putrid form and meowed. Jake's face broke into a mean grin. Come on, dude. I'm sick of being your puppet. He grabbed his axe and marched toward the water with the goal to kill. Their guttural cries filled the air, and their claws dug into warm skin. Jake danced in the middle of the press, cutting and tearing with practiced cruelty. Body parts and limbs were all over the ground, covered in blood. As the last one fell, Jake turned around to face the huge stronghold that stood above the pit. His eyes were wild and gleamed under the gore. He charged the broken scaffolding with a wild howl, finding handholds where none seemed possible. With each pounding hit from below, the metal screamed, and the whole structure shook. Cracks appeared all over the rusty plates, and with each hit, the shaking went higher. Scared screams could be heard above the grinding metal and falling concrete. People strewn around in a confused panic, ignoring rules and customs as the unstoppable force clawed its way higher. Finally, there was a loud crack, and the whole building started to fold in on itself. Jake jumped free just seconds before a mountain of broken dreams fell into the pit from bent steel and stone. Jake looked at the ruins when he came out of the dusty haze. There was no movement among the dead bodies. By leaving only ashes and bones behind, he began the long march with his axe in his hand. He twisted his lips into a grim smile. Now, only the wilderness was left, where life was forged anew every bloody day until fate finally caught up with him and took him too. He was free for now, though. He opened his eyes and saw that it was dark. As he tried to look into the empty space around him, sharp pain shot through his head. He couldn't figure out where he was or how he got to this strange place because he was lost. Over time, the shadows in the darkness faded into faint lines. There were metal beds and curtains, as well as wires and tubes hanging down and running along the floor. There was an awfully sweet smell in the air that made him nervous. He was in the hospital. Nowhere to be found were the patients, doctors, or nurses. There was a creepy silence in the empty room. Colin stumbled to his feet and shuffled forward, putting his fingers on the dusty walls to steady himself. With every lurching step, broken glass and other things hit the ground. He was very thirsty, but he also felt a bad hunger in the pit of his stomach that he couldn't explain. He followed his gut down the hallway to look. Each opening led to a more desolate area with empty gurneys, papers lying around, and used medical gloves that had been thrown away. As his worry grew, it amplified sounds in the dark, like rats scratching, pipes creaking, and drafts whispering. A bunch of dried brown spots on the floor stopped him in his tracks. The bite, the screams, and the fear all came back to her in a rush. In the dark, someone had attacked him, their fangs tearing into his skin and poison flooding his veins. He remembers that as the disease spread, there was fire under his skin. Waking up crazy and hungry, biting anyone who got close. As his crazy behavior took over, his family and coworkers ran away in fear. He started to sob. Did he kill them? Change the people he loved into the scary monsters that now ruled the night? A moan from deep inside the hospital woke him up from his pain. Like him, other people had sensed fresh meat. He had to get away before they caught up with him. Colin lurched down the stairs, and the adrenaline made the pain go away. Every step hurt his broken bones, but he couldn't stop because hungry animals were coming down on him. He finally got out into a back alley and fell against a dumpster, gasping for air. The view of the city before him made it clear that the end of the world was near. Unchecked fires made it hard to see the people scrambling through the streets in search of victims. Roads were clogged with abandoned cars, and doors were hanging open where scared people had run away from their last desperate fights. The city he used to know was gone, replaced by a smoldering wreck. The hungry hordes had destroyed civilization and eaten everything in its path. In the distance, automatic shooting shook for a few seconds before going quiet. The people who were using it were probably too stressed to keep firing. There was no more safety. He was all by himself in a nightmare, come true, and his only goal was to feed the never-ending void inside him. As soon as the first screams were heard on the wind, Colin jumped into the chaos and turned into the thing that now walked the streets of this city of the dead. Colin stumbled through empty streets at night, and the smell of rot was strong in the air. Horrors that should not be seen were hidden in the shadows, but his hunger drove him to keep going in search of food. A flickering glow called from inside a shop that had been gutted. Colin looked around the corner with care. By the glow of the fire, two tired survivors argued, but he wasn't aware of their presence. One guy begged for a bigger share of their meager food, but his companion rudely refused. The hoarder growled and waved a rusty pipe around. "That ain't enough for 3. One of us don't need to eat no more." Because they were tired and broke, they turned on each other. Colin was glued to the screen as the guys fought, their anger reopening old wounds. The ground was covered in blood, and the smell of copper hung heavy in the air. Within seconds, 2 had grown to 4, and then to 8. The crowd was getting closer and closer to that tempting siren call. Colin ate while the bodies were being burned because he could no longer control his twisted urges. Still, the hunger lingered, a hole that could never be filled. Now that he was full, he lurched on. The graveyard ahead was marked by flickering lights, and its khaki tents were full of survivors looking for safety in numbers. Over the radio, a frantic voice read out patrol plans and warned people to be on the lookout for dead bodies. They should have been afraid of the living, not the dead. That night, a group of thieves came back with trophies from a store they had broken into, but other people attacked them because they thought they had saved too much for themselves. Guns were drawn and fired. When everyone turned on each other out of fear, greed, and a desire to kill, safety in numbers didn't mean much. In just a few hours, the camp turned into a shithouse, with infected people pouring through recently cut fences while attackers and defenders ate each other. No one was safe from the disease that was spreading. Colin woke up in the middle of the bloodshed and had to claw his way out from under the bodies that were piled on top of each other. All around, there were destroyed camps with bodies of people who had been killed inside. As he stumbled through the spooky ruins, his fever drove him crazy, and his desires and disgust were at odds with each other. As he searched the ruins, he came across a church where survivors had made their last stand. The decorated windows were filled with bullet holes that made it impossible to pray. There were piles of dead bodies inside, souls that had died of hunger or turned on their family and friends. At the altar, a priest who was completely naked knelt in prayer. All around him, a huge number of candles cast crazy shadows on the walls that were covered in bloody drawings. When Colin got close, the fanatic spun around and pointed a shotgun with a crazy look in his eye. "Get back, devils. This holy place will not be dirty by your filthy kind." Colin took 2 blows to the stomach that tore it apart before he threw the gun away and jumped on the man with a rabid need. Sharp teeth bit into the priest's neck, and Colin's mouth filled with hot blood in a painful baptism. The days and nights became a horror that I was awake in. Colin, who was very hungry, watched as the destroyed city was slowly taken back. The only sound in the destroyed areas was the mindless shuffles of the dead. The few people who were still alive reverted to their basic instincts and attacked each other with savage fury. Civilization died while its own citizens' twitching bodies came back to life. All humanity was lost to madness and rot as the infected hordes swarmed out to feed on a world that had been destroyed by plague and betrayal. Colin hid in the rubble and watched the people who were still alive. Even though it had been weeks since the city fell, the dead were still walking the streets that were once full of life. A rough band came out of the ruins, its skin tight around bones that stuck out. Their droopy eyes showed a wild intelligence that came from having to fight for food all the time. Arms like worn-out guns and pipes were held out to protect themselves from the hungry people who were stumbling around looking for food. Their thin eyes kept watch all the time, marking each piece of land as if it were cut from the same block of flesh. This group was living off of very little food and was holding on by the skin of their teeth. The walls of their complex were burned and pitted from many attacks by the ravenous infected both inside and outside. Colin was very aware of how bad things were for them. He thought about better times, like having picnics in the park with his beloved wife, Sarah, and laughing together while reading books in their cozy apartment. She kissed him again when he closed his eyes, but each day he felt more hungry. As a group of people who had been scavenging came back to the complex with their arms full of small items, a familiar pain woke up. It's not enough. Insufficient to stop the pain of such a deep void. Colin was watching the survivors split up their loot when he heard cries coming from down the street. It was like a gnashing wave coming towards the compound. A large group of dozens of former men, women, and children, with faces worn down to a laughing core, came into view. Their wrecks charged together, trying to eat because they are always hungry. Automatic fire tore through rotting flesh with little effect. Bullets only hurt dumb limbs. Panicked screams could be heard inside the cinder block walls as the infected climbed higher, pawing through the barbed wire with their twisted bodies. While they were scuffling, the barrier fell apart. The last defenses came down with a shiver of stone and a cry of hopelessness. Colin lurched forward into the chaos, his mouth open in shock. Gunshots and screams mixed into a chorus of wild animals as survivors fought and ate at the same time. Old walls fell down in the wake of people's desperate needs. In this small version of the bigger world, people were reduced to their most basic needs and were fighting cruelly to keep their flickering lives going for one more moment. The days went by quickly as they ate and roamed. As Colin walked through the empty areas late at night, he heard a familiar tune coming from an old apartment building. He listened to the song out of curiosity. It was a man's smooth tenor voice, drifting through broken windows. Inside, there was a skinny man writing poetry by candlelight, and the walls were covered with faded pictures of better times. He met Colin's stumbling body with a tired sigh, as if he had known this was going to happen for a long time. "Welcome, friend, even though you look sad. Come share what comfort verse may bring in this dark new world." His voice was sad and beautiful, which lifted Colin's mood. He saw bits and pieces of his old life through the poet's eyes, love that had been lost to hunger and betrayal. As dawn broke over the ruins, Colin left the artist to repeat his sad chants. He left with an ache that no feast could ever satisfy. As night fell, the ruins went silent. Under the growing jungle that was taking back the city, there were no signs of people at all. Vines grew over snarled cars and stores that had fallen down. It was quick to go back to nature without man's industry to stop it. Colin was the only one of his kind that still had feelings. Everyone else had lost all sense of kindness or reason because the infection made them want to do whatever it took. Now that he was the only one left alive in this country of the dead, he roamed these ruins. A sound of scuttling made him stop. From the darkness, many pairs of glowing eyes looked at him with hunger. Slowly, the owners came out of the dark, revealing Spider, like beings the size of dogs with round heads and legs that didn't connect normally. As they cautiously circled and chattered, Colin felt real fear for the first time. These were not the animals that nature made. In the dark places below the world, something lived and moved, making new monsters as the old order fell apart. These things lunged and moaned in pain. Colin met them with sharp teeth and muscles that were tight from fighting all the time, tearing and twisting until the last monster stopped moving. Heaving and soaked in ichor, he let out a sob from his broken chest. How long could a person stay in this hell? Would he ever be saved, or would he always be a lone guardian over a dead world that was boiling over with its own bad moods? As the last screams died down and the moon slowly set in the west, Colin felt a chill go deeper into his body. Over the horizon, there was a sound that shook old stones in their cement beds like the bells of 1,000 worlds. It got louder as he stumbled toward the sound, half out of fear and half out of sick interest. Huge towers that shouldn't or couldn't be there rose over blackened hills that were silhouetted against the pale sky. He heard crazy whispers that named obscene shapes that made him feel unnamed terrors. The structures moved as if they were living, their snake-like necks twisting toward the only person who saw how they were made in an unholy way. And a chorus came from the tops of them that froze the last bits of pity in Colin's broken soul. He turned away from the strange scene and ran away, but the sound of the choir's death would resound through all the dead years to come. For on that empty plain, in the shadow of blasphemously cut magical towers, the next stage of obscene evolution was rising to take over a world left empty for darker seeds. It never got light. Even though it was getting dark outside, Colin's sad cries were the only sound coming from the world of ancient, lifeless victories that shouldn't have been calling to his dying soul. So in society and hope, in the ruins, shapeless nightmares with crawling bellies and seething mandibles shook, waiting for the right time to make the whole world look like them, which is blasphemous. The wailing alarms broke up the night and called us to unknown horrors. As our police car sped through the empty city streets, the empty sidewalks, which had seemed strange at first, became usual. Sergeant Lowry had a tight grip on the driving wheel, and his knuckles were turning pale because of the flashing lights on top of our car. It was another call from the docks, he grunted. I looked out the window at the empty storefronts and tall buildings, but I couldn't see any signs of life. Even though the spread had only been going on for a week, the city already felt like it was empty. The radio was crackling with messages. Somehow, survivors were being caught by those things near the old fish market. The shotgun was between my legs, and my hand was resting on it uneasily. We were the only police car sent out. These days, reinforcements were thin, and supplies were running out as quickly as people were dying. I tried not to think of old friends who had died at the hands of the hungry demons that were roaming our streets. If we aren't careful, their fate could easily become ours. As we slid up to a nightmare, the braking tires woke me up from my dark thoughts. Flashing lights showed a family huddled together in fear at a chain-link fence, surrounded by writhing groups of sick people. They pushed and scratched, and their limbs jerked them toward fresh meat in a way that didn't make sense. Some became distracted when we showed up, their tattered faces snapping their mouths together. "Help us, please." Through the fence, a man begged. Lowry opened the door quickly. "Evacuate the civilians. I'll cover you." He yelled over his shoulder and raised his riot gun with both hands. I jumped out and ran to the fence, shaking with excitement as I tried to open the lock. I caught Lowry's shotgun firing in the corner of my eye. The loud blasts tore nearby, infected into crumbling piles. As the family ran through the fence, I yanked it open and led them to the car. That's when it took place. Behind us, there was a guttural roar that was unlike any other sound I'd heard from an animal. I turned around and saw a huge infected tear into Lowry's head, with jaws that looked like they could hold anything, his body spasming in vain as his shotgun clattered away. A father grabbed his crying daughter and put his arms around her to protect her eyes from the animal abuse. More showed up. Hellish screams came from running abominations that made my blood boil. I saw police officers and regular people who had been twisted into mindless animals that were hungry for warm meat. We were swarmed. Training and weapons didn't help against so many people who were crazy with a desire to kill. When I got my hands on a small handgun, I fired it without stopping until the slide stopped moving. When they came after us, the cruiser doors were wide open to let them in. For many, it was already over. I grabbed the old woman by the arm and pulled her away from the claws. "Run!" I yelled at the survivors and pushed them out of the way as I went down a narrow alley. As we ran for our lives, our feelings told us which darkened windows and doors to run through quickly. Behind us, screams turned into liquid gurgles and then stopped. I didn't dare look back at the shadows that were slowly going away, full of new kills. We came out of the alley into a small parking lot surrounded by down flats. Under the dim moonlight, a playground that had been closed off was very still. My throat hurt when I breathed, and my legs were shaking from working out so hard. There were only 4 of us left. Me, an older woman, a teenage boy, and a young mother holding her baby close in fear. With a shaking hand, I pulled out my gun again. Inside. Now, my voice sounded strange, cracked and so tired that it was unrecognizable. We ran to the closest apartment building as howls of wild animals could be heard in the distance, sealing our fate. We were stuck in the dark with unknown horrors waiting inside. There were dark shapes moving through apartment 2. As our supply ran out, we carefully crowded around a flickering candle. The windows were locked with boards, and barriers were stacked close to the only entrance. A scary scratching sound came from the hallway, which made Isabella whimper and hug her baby even tighter. As I paced restlessly and checked our defenses a dozen times, my fingers curled tight around the grip of my gun. It had been 2 days since our failed flight to this abandoned apartment building, and supplies were getting very low. 4 people who were still alive were left with only food scraps and a few liters of water. Knowing that any mistake could be our last made me feel responsible. Behind me, I heard a soft voice. "You need to rest, kid. Wearing a hole in the floor won't make our situation better." What an old woman flower sat in the corner with her head bowed and her tired hands in her lap. Even though she had dark circles under her eyes, her look stayed strong. I turned my head away. Can't. Need to keep us safe. I weakly waved my arm at our weak defenses. The sick people will be back, always showing up. As if called, a loud crash shook our locked door, followed by rasping moans. We jerked back as claw, like fingers scraped against the barrier, looking for souls to drag into hell. Isabella screamed and Flora grabbed her arm tightly and whispered comforting words. I raised my gun and tensed up my finger on the trigger, even though I knew I couldn't shoot with that many people around me. After what seemed like hours, the attack stopped further down the hall. I rubbed my dirty eyes and let out a sigh as my legs gave out from exhaustion. We have to leave. No matter what we do, they'll get through in the end. Behind me, I heard a voice I knew. What the boy says is true. Forts fall, but cunning can still save you. As I spun around with my gun raised, I looked down the barrel at a thin face looking through the boarded-up windows. The man's greasy hair and ragged beard were hard to see because of the way the wood planks were stacked on top of each other. "Who are you?" My aim didn't drop as I growled. "Hi, my name is Jacob. Have been getting by in these parts since the beginning. You can get around this piece of concrete that other people can't." He gave my gun a cool look. "Listen to me if you want to live. Let me help you stay safe. If you agree to follow my lead, I have a plan." Even though I didn't trust this homeless person very much, my grip stayed strong and my suspicious curiosity grew. Given how bad things could get, any spark of hope was worth looking at. "Say what you want, Jacob, but hurry up." He smiled, and a few of his teeth could be seen. "Hey, glad to hear that. Pay close attention, because this will require more than luck to succeed." It was while the skinny man was explaining his plan that I saw someone else sneaking out from behind him. A masked criminal leaned casually against the wall and thumbed a long knife with serrated edges with a disturbing focus. What brand? New evil had we let into our home? I could only hope that Jacob's plans were our only chance at dawn. The infected masses swarmed just outside our locked refuge, waiting for any strange vibration to set off another round of frantic hitting on our weak defenses. Jacob's strange source, whom he called Gutter, sniffed the air and talked about how things were about to change on the wind. His predictions didn't make me feel better as our disorganized group went over our plans one last time, by candlelight. The cargo truck's engine shook and hissed for a long time after its last few windy miles, finally giving up as we left that abandoned city. We were all feeling sad as a weak amber light gathered around the one fuel canister that was still alive and burning in the old, broken, down house. After getting away from the docks, no one spoke until a long time after the terrible fires faded into the smoky distance. I let out a heavy breath and leaned against a dirty piece of metal, holstering my smoke. Stained gun. The baby was being nursed by Isabella in silence, her eyes sad. Caleb looked out into the dark night sky. Only Flora stayed calm, watching our crumbling safe haven with a worn-out gaze. "They died so we could see another dawn," she finally said in a creaky voice. "Best honor it, lest their sacrifices be in vain." Nobody wanted to nod when she spoke. We had come too far, through unimaginable horrors, to give up now because we were tired or our hope was fading. I gathered my strength and gave our survivors a tired half. Smile. "Come, let's go while the moon is still out." We left into the night in a calm but determined way. Step by painful step, the rolling farmland took in our tracks. Our numb legs trudged toward an unseeable safe haven beyond the edge of our awareness. The huge emptiness helped calm jitters to a certain point. It was huge and didn't care about the plight of humans. In the never-ending gloom, time lost its meaning. I just kept putting one foot in front of the other, thankful that I didn't have to think about the memories all the time. All of them were about to fall into the abyss until Isabella's oft cooing stopped them. Wary shapes came out of the mist when dawn finally lit up the eastern sky in soft, ethereal colors. A run-down farmhouse appeared in front of tired eyes. A safe haven that had been empty for a long time, but still provided protection. I fell asleep on the worn-out porch, while others went inside to rest, not caring if there were ghosts inside. Hours went by in a dead sleep. Finally stirring, I saw the others stirring weakly by a small fire inside. They looked alive again, fed by the break and each other's company. Even if it was only for a short time, there was a spark of hope. Maybe they could stay alive, even if it meant taking one tired step at a time. Our rest wouldn't last long. Gunfire could be heard in the distance, its sharp, erratic sound reverberating off the walls of a rural valley. I braced myself and crept around the house to get a better view. In a clearing past the fallow rice paddies, troops in camouflage moved through the wandering, infected with practiced coordination. After that, armored trucks drove deeper into the countryside, which was a sign that bigger camps were waiting for refugees like us. Hope. A word that had been tainted for a long time flickered softly once more, casting a dark but determined light over our destroyed world, no matter what troubles were ahead. Dawn had given us the strength to keep going. A dirty tip of Jacob's finger went around our rough map that was written on particle board. Guys, you all know your stuff. We'll light her up good and draw as many jerks down Main as we can, as soon as the clock hits 12. That's your flag. Move quickly and go straight for the docks through the back streets. The truck will be waiting by slip 5 with the keys in the wheel well as planned. I gave a tight nod while thinking about what could go wrong for the 100th time. Isabella held her baby close, and Flora gripped a homemade club with white-knuckled determination, even though she looked scared. Our teen charge, Caleb fidgeted with an empty gun while his eyes were sad, outside the boarded-up window. A series of inhuman cries signaled that Jacob and Gutter's experiment was about to start. Let's go, now. I grunted as I carried a broken-down pack and a limp gun. Stay down low and quiet as a grave. Stop for no reason, do you get it? Our chorus of encouragement mixed with the chaos outside, which was getting worse. Then we scampered out into a dark hallway, hoping that our quiet steps would keep us from being seen. The long drop seemed to go on forever, and every sound was amplified 10 times. Finally, a rusty escape door showed up. The streets beyond were full of nightmares. I made myself strong and pushed through, ready for an attack that was about to happen. Instead, what we saw was complete chaos. A tidal wave of insane infected eating frantically on unknown sources of their induced craziness. A city that had been abandoned and turned into a staging area for hell itself was lit up by flickering firelight. We snuck quickly down alleys that were full of trash because we saw an opening. Snatches of wild screams and gut. Wrenching noises could be heard on the smoky breeze as the fake fireworks did their horrible job. Gutter and Jacob were smart. They kept the crowds moving by creating clever delays while avoiding being slashed by claws. They were perfect in their time. Finally, the docks came into view. They looked like a huge graveyard with rusty goods and worn-out piers. Even from far away, we could smell the smell of brine and death. Any way you look at it, seeing that huge vehicle waiting for us in the dark was a nice sight. I let out a short sigh of relief and waved the others on with even more speed. That relief went away just as quickly as it came. Coming out of the alleys behind us weren't hungry infected, but figures wielding lengths of pipe and crowbars with a frightening determination. Raiders with eyes that sparkled in the fire, who were clearly sick of Jacob and Gutter's games. Their finding ended all hopes of sneaking through. I yelled to the others, "We're cut off. I'll hold them back while you get to the truck." I fumbled with my gun as I turned to face the downward monsters, giving up my cover in our last moments. Isabella screamed behind me as I fired at the charging shadows, buying valuable seconds. My last thought was that I had failed and prayed that their death would save others.